As a state, sometimes euphemistically described as New India, Hindutva has revived the dominant political culture in the country and forced even non-Hindutva political formations to accept its core premises about India's history, society, and the state. It is relentlessly totalitarian in its programs and practices, seeking complete socio-cultural homogenization under its Hindu Hindustan project. This is not to say Hindutva has a total control of all the social and political imaginaries in India, as several panelists in this conference have already noted. It has not yet fully succeeded in assimilating those who have always seen themselves at odds with the post-colonial state's projects. But as Arjun Appadurai has argued, Hindutva's totalitarian regime, while facing India's typical challenge, for instance, of endless laws and zero compliance, has effectively used harassment of targeted samples of population via CAA and NRC, and brutal acts of violence as tyranny by example to create the illusion of totality. To see Hindutva as a state enables us to unmask its political rhetoric, even its unexpected, if too facile, public claims of inclusivity, development of all the 130 crore Indians, or equal rights for Kashmiris as internal compulsions of statecraft rather than as signs of Hindutva's ideological moderation. The rise of Hindutva state may still appear as if it is fully fleshed out in different parts of India. I argue that its takeover is most clearly visible from the experiences of Kashmiris. The events of August 5, 2019 are a critical event that not only forced the people of Kashmir into an existential crisis, but also signaled India's ruling powers' open acknowledgement of Hindutva having become a state. Unlike the religious reform movements or communal interest-based parties and organizations from which it grew, Hindutva has all along been a statist ideology. Its claims were not about special representation or differential provisions, but about centering the state as the means to construct a homogeneous ethno-religious majority and to ensure its permanent domination. From its inception, that is, since the last decades of the British Empire, Hindutva has tied the nexus of its practice and ideology to the progression of the state, the emerge of the nascent and the established India. Hindutva has always had foreign and domestic policies, and it has had its own conception of sovereignty, territoriality, citizenship, economy, and national culture. It has acted always as if it already was the state or was going to become one. Hindutva state did not stand parallel to the Indian state and its constitution, nor did it stand hidden or masked underneath the state. I would argue, to echo Philip Abrams' older conception of the state, that the Indian state is not the reality that stands behind the Hindutva political practice, and which can then be recovered through some imagined return to a secular India or Hindustan, as liberal activists and scholars seek. The Indian state itself has acted as a mask, which hid the workings of the Hindutva state. The latter has existed as a substantive presence, as coterminous and contiguous in the everyday life of the state. The Hindutva state fermented post-colonial India's imperial vision and supremacist desires, which were most visible at the very beginning in Kashmir. Hindutva also used India's ostensibly secular institutions to validate Hindutva's majoritarian ethos. In fact, the official state ideology of secularism has not necessarily been antagonistic to the Hindutva state ideology. It has used self-servingly but effectively the rhetoric of secularism to advance its own ideological control. Its key campaigns, like those for the so-called Uniform Civil Code, population control, Hajj subsidy, etc., have sought to pit a hard secular rhetoric against what it described as the pseudo-secularism of non-Hindutva parties. In the construction of the Ram Temple, a manifestly non-secular event has been turned around to be a test of secularism for India's Muslims. The Hindutva state sees its creed as inherently secular, without a hint of irony. All in all, Hindutva political practice created condition for it to take over a state that was ready to receive it. My second point is related to the position of Muslims in relationship to this new state. Like other majoritarian states that require a demonized minority as their raison d'etre, the Hindutva state critically depends on the figure of the Muslim, Mullah, Musalman, as it likes to call it, to stand in that role. But here is the difference with the other such states. The Hindutva state is not simply majoritarian because it actively pursues the interests of the Hindus. Indeed, rights among those called Hindus are also not equally distributed, and many continue to be oppressed, even though Hindutva has arrogated to itself the right to speak in the name of all Hindus. It's also true that Hindutva ideologues stage many kinds of adversaries, including liberals, Christians, communists, Dalits, Adivasis, who are often seen as conspiring together. The Hindutva state, I argue, is primarily an anti-Muslim state. It has created a political culture among the majority, the so-called majority, which instead of seeking the advancement of its own material political interests, actively prefers to cheer the denial of rights to the Muslims. Muslim, as an antipathic exteriority, is structural to the Hindutva state, and Muslim exteriority is continuously reinscribed through ritualized violence within a context where Muslim proximity is historical and interwoven into the social sphere. Muslims have a structural significance for excellence to the Hindutva state, also because they are geographically present across almost all of India, both within, along the border, and outside. This geographic spread enables the Hindutva state to perform its anti-Muslim politics as an exercise of territorial sovereignty. The Hindutva state's key political gesture is to produce spectacles of domination based on an unending humiliation of Muslims. These spectacles are ritualized brutalizations performed by Hindutva citizen enforcers within a public sphere that the Hindutva state has constructed specifically for these spectacles. The spectacles are meant to ignite passions of dominance among Hindus and moods of impotence among Muslims. To heighten the spectacles of humiliation, Hindutva citizen enforcers specifically choose the poorest and the most vulnerable among the Muslims. In Kashmir, Indian soldiers become performers of these spectacles. They create videos as they dynamite Kashmiri houses, mutilate Kashmiri dead bodies, or parade Kashmiris as human shields, and then circulate the videos back into the Hindutva's public space, where they are celebrated as Hindutva's victories. In online spaces, Hindutva citizen enforcers expend considerable effort borrowing Western Islamophobic caricatures of Muslims, inventing many on their own and deriding Islam as a religion. In addition to this, the Hindutva state actively suppresses any reference to Muslim cultural artifacts or brazenly appropriates these artifacts through renaming and fictionalization. This brazenness, which is defying established and well-known facts, reveals that the gestures of domination are intentional and strategic, not an effect. As a state, Hindutva does differentiate between four locations of Muslim body politic, which shapes their distinct approach to them. The first is the Muslims of India, who are staged as a homogenous ethno-religious other. They are, racialized, victimized, and framed as suspect, assaulted, and constantly asked to prove loyalty to the Hindutva state. There's a subset of Indian Muslims who are described as nationalist Muslims, who are required to perform religious and cultural inferiority to be seen as loyal. For instance, the Rashtriya Muslim Manch, a group of Muslims linked to the RSS, represent nationalist Muslims. They are called on to perform nationalism and pay homage to Hindu religious icons, but are never incorporated as equals. Their acquiescent rituals enable the Hindutva state to accord superiority to their own religion. And I want to also note here that the Congress and other parties may not laud these spectacles of domination, but they have also not protested most of the signature Hindutva projects targeting Muslims, like Supreme Court's Ayodhya ruling, the CAA, Triple Talaq. In fact, in recent years, they have actively sought to not be seen close to Muslims or to seek their vote, and have therefore contributed to the Hindutva project of invisibilizing more than 180 million Muslims from the Indian political society. There are two other, Pakistan and there are Arab Gulf states where Hindutva acts quite differentially. But I do want to, because of limited time, focus a little bit on the main Muslim body politic upon which Hindutva state enacts its spectacles of domination most vehemently, and the brazenness of its politics finds little to no opposition, and this group is the Kashmiri Muslims, where Hindutva state acts as a predatory formation and constantly produces elementary brutalities. Kashmiri scholars and others have painstakingly detailed and examined the nature and effects of Indian military occupation in Kashmir. But less light has so far been shed on how Hindutva has shaped Indian state policies and practices in Kashmir. Even though it is common knowledge in Kashmir, if you go around and you do research in Kashmir, you can actually understand a lot about Hindutva state speaking to ordinary Kashmiris. Part of the reason why the military occupation in Kashmir has not included a simultaneous examination of the Hindutva state is because of the way Kashmiris see the events of 1947. One could, go back to it, to that year, but the main thing I want to argue is that Kashmir emerged in that year from a long century of an actually existing Hindutva state, which had been ruling over a mostly Muslim subject population. What is described as the Dogra princely state was, for all practical purposes, the state that Hindutva ideology aspires to achieve, and which historian Mridul Roy has described as, Hindutva rulers ruling over Muslim subjects. Most of the symbolic political issues of Hindutva agitational politics in India had already been consecrated into the laws of the Dogra state, including laws banning cow slaughter and other restrictions on Muslim diet, state funding for temple construction, which was extracted mostly from the heavily taxed Muslim subjects, exclusion of Kashmiri Muslims from the state's politics, bureaucracy, and military, arming of the Hindus, differential criminal code for Muslims and Hindus, renaming of Kashmiri Muslim place names to Sanskrit ones, erasure of Kashmiri Muslim cultural history, and in general, enabling a system where spectacles of public humiliation of Kashmiri Muslims using cruel practices like flogging, chob, begar, and forced nakedness had become normalized. The Dogra state, as Mridul Roy has pointed out, saw itself as embodying Hindu sovereignty. I know I'm running out of time here, but I just want to quickly, just 1 minute, simply state that Hindutva has a long history in Kashmir, starting from 1947 onwards. It saw the land reforms in Kashmir as not just a challenge to Hindu sovereignty, but also as a wrong precedent to set, where Muslims could aspire from equality within the Indian nation state, and immediately launched into this project starting 1952, where the early promises of the Indian state to Kashmiris were systematically eroded, starting with the Article 370 itself, which had already been kind of emptied out with the presidential order of 1954. The events of, and then this entire slogan of Ek Vidhan, Ek Nishan, Ek Pradhan was primarily targeted to prevent a creation of a precedent where Muslims could aspire for equality. So the events of August 5, 2019, which in Kashmir truly really meant nothing, because Kashmir was already the most directly controlled state in India. It was already controlled from New Delhi, was done as a foundational violence. It was an assertion of what the Hindutva state could do, and to set a precedent where even the sign and symbol of any Muslim political identity or a Muslim body politic could exist. And I just want to quickly say to end this, that the Hindutva state wishes to see only, it has, of course, it either wants to set up a Kashmir where all Kashmiris are completely silent, or if any political assertion is made, they primarily want to set up a settler colonial state where there will be no space for Kashmir. I hope we can address some of these questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Professor Junaid, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Artatong Longcomer. Dr. Longcomer is a senior lecturer in modern Asia at the University of Edinburgh. He is the author of The Greater Indian Experiment, Hindutva and the Northeast, and the co-author of Indigenous Religions, Land, Local Grounds, Global Networks, and co-editor of Neo Hindutva. He's currently working on different projects ranging from tattoos, seeds, issues of repatriation, gurus, and media in India. His topic today is Hindutva Futures.
Thank you. And thank you for that introduction. I'll just share my screen quickly. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay. It is widely acknowledged that the presence and power of the Hindu right are here to stay in contemporary India. Even in the northeast of India, often viewed as a recalcitrant periphery, away from the gaze of the Indian state, the diffusion of the Hindu right ideology has found fertile ground. Their activities are not only limited to party politics, with many of the northeastern states now under the political orbit of the BJP, but their presence is also in cultural and social spheres. What are the challenges? And indeed, what are the Hindutva futures in this vastly complex and tempestuous region called the Northeast? One way the Sangh Parivar include this region is through the visual media of maps and the argument for a greater India. One of the most striking aspects of my visit to Sangh Parivar offices all across the region is their visual and material representation of regional icons associated with the different states. In Nagaland, it is either Rani Gaidinlu or NC Ziliang, well-known Naga leaders associated with the Harappa movement, who are celebrated as icons by the Sangh Parivar. In Arunachal Pradesh, it is Talum Rogdu, an important social reformer associated with the religion Donyo Polo. Or in Manipur and Assam, it is Iti Singh and Gopinath Bordoloi, who are recognized as freedom fighters who fought against Muslim and British invaders, respectively. There are also various images of deities and visual representations of maps, and Bharat Mata often figure prominently. These visuals appear on the walls of hostels, institutions, and offices, or they're garlanded with flowers in various locations. They're also sold as artifacts in shops where people might want to buy these cherished objects representing a panoply of various national and regional figures that give credence to the message of the Hindu right as diverse and not simply from particular pockets of India. Maps are useful to visually depict the contours of a nation, its borders, where places meet, and most importantly, to evoke a kind of anthropomorphic evocation of place names and people etched onto the fabric of the map's canvas. The Sangh Parivar have indeed done this to provide a visual record of extant social roles and relations. And it is these relations that are at the forefront of their conceptualization of Greater India. One should not be surprised then that the Northeast is at the center of this conceptualization. M.S. Golwalkar, the second Sarsanchalak of the RSS, evokes the idea of Akhand Bharat, or undivided India, to give us a sense of the expanse of this territorial imagination. Drawing on the epics, such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Puranas, Golwalkar guides us through what he calls the expansive image of our motherland, from Afghanistan, Iran, Burma, Assam, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and the lofty Himalayas as the pinnacle of this eternal presence, immortalized in myth, legends, deities, and through events that have shaped the land. Imagine another way, like Bharata, like Varsh, an idea found in the Mahabharata, covers the land that consists of an area from the Indus to the seas and below the Himalayas. So like whether it is Bharatvarsh or Akhand Bharat, there is a sense in which the expanse of this greater India is not only visually depicted through maps, but constructed actively through myths and stories. For too long, the Sangh Parivar argue, the Northeast is viewed as a separate enclave, a site for secessionism, and appears in the lexicon of administrative and political thought as the recalcitrant periphery. But they say the greater India idea requires that the Northeast is at its center, a meeting place that links the Indic, Himalaya, Tibeto, Burman, Mon Khmer, like linguistic and cultural groups, a place where the crossing and dwelling of these various identities ensues productive contact zones. For instance, they draw on the story of Krishna and Rukmini to illustrate the connection of the region with the rest of India since the beginning of time. On 28th of March 2018, the chief ministers of Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, and Gujarat came together to celebrate the marriage of Lord Krishna and Rukmini during the 4-day Madhavpur fair in Gujarat. A few hundred cultural troops from the Northeast arrived in like Madhavpur as Rukmini's representative to symbolize the immortal journey that she undertook from Arunachal Pradesh to Gujarat to marry Lord Krishna. The cultural razzmatazz and the political symbolism could not have been more striking through the slogan, One India, Great India. In Arunachal Pradesh, that reaction was mixed. Some celebrated the event by reproducing visual accompaniments to this immortal journey of Rukmini and Krishna as a local Arunachali couple in a pastoral landscape. Others were more circumspect of the connection and indeed the attempt by various forces to impose such a narrative when none existed. But perhaps that is not the point, argues one of the Sangh Parivar collaborators who took part in the event from the Arunachali side. He acknowledged that this Rukmini episode is not about precision. It is in fact the case that many versions of this Rukmini Krishna story abound in Maharashtra, Gujarat, and now Arunachal. It is also futile, he suggests, to go searching for archaeological evidence to support such claims, or to find contradictory accounts to question its veracity. What is more important, he notes, is to focus on the stories. And this is how, he said, myth becomes history. Some Arunachalis were keen to take ownership of the Rukmini story and even argue that it provides social capital to be equated with Krishna and the larger Indic universe. Some even suggested that the story gradually over time will naturalize and become part of the narrative landscape, for these are how things are created. It is important to return to Savarkar's conceptualization of Hindutva and how the territorial designs that he imagined does not explicitly mention the current geopolitical reality of Northeast India. Does this suggest that Savarkar was not including this area, that he was ignorant of it, or simply it was just a matter of fact that this was a region under Assam and by default included? These are the sorts of questions that come up in different conversations I have had with both locals of the region and various Sangh Parivar activists about how the Northeast fits in. For those opposing its inclusion, they point to these texts and argue that since Northeast is not mentioned, or that Meghalaya or like Mizoram are not specified, then it was never a part of India. The Sangh Parivar have a different way of understanding this problem, as I've shown. And it is important to emphasize that these discussions are not about unearthing the truth, but there are different ways of knowledge production and understanding of the world that might come into sharp relief with what people are used to. It further situates the Northeast as central to the visualization and indeed conceptualization of Greater India, not simply as an idea waiting to be realized, but significantly as a place that has the power to unleash itself to have application. What possible avenues and questions can we pose with regard to Hindutva, given its importance in contemporary India? Will resistance continue, or would the region capitulate to its dominance? Or will we see another Northeast emerge, one that is both a periphery to the Indian state and also the center of the vast highland region of Asia as it connects with various regional brokers, a contact zone where different cultural and religious practices synchronize effectively, a place that also has the capacity to aspire for newer social experiments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Longcomere, for that talk. Our next speaker is Professor Nandini Sundar. Professor Sundar is a professor of sociology at the Delhi School of Economics and Delhi University. Her most recent book is The Burning Forest, India's War Against the Maoists. Today, the panel for the topic today is indigeneity and supremacism.
So, in the spirit of acknowledging the indigenous territories on which North American universities and conferences are hosted, even if they are virtual conferences, and since this is about global Hindutva, let me start by saying Jai Johar, Jai Bhim to everyone. The scheduled tribes constitute 8.6% of the Indian population, comprising some 705 different communities listed under Article 342. The Hindu Marriage Act 1955, Section 2 clearly states that, and I quote, "Nothing contained in this act shall apply to the members of any scheduled tribe within the meaning of Clause 25 of Article 366 of the Constitution," unquote. Unlike the scheduled castes, reservation among the scheduled tribes is not dependent on being a Hindu. In other words, by law and constitution, scheduled tribes are not automatically considered Hindu. Some of them are Hindus, some are Christians, while yet others are Muslim, as in Lakshadweep. But a large number follow their own Adivasi practices and beliefs. And yet, these distinct Adivasi faiths have been practically obliterated through the census, through educational policies which separate children from their families, their languages, and their culture, and through laws governing resource acquisition. When it comes to Adivasis, the first existential fight is to have their gods recognized. The lack of recognition has several implications and is both an enabling cause and consequence of the dispossession of resources. The Hindu supremacy or Hindutva of the current RSS-BJP regime is of a totally different order in its contempt for Adivasi religion, languages, and identity, even as it seeks to recruit Adivasis in the Hindutva fold and mobilize them as foot soldiers in its pogroms against Muslims and Christians, as we saw in Godhra in 2002 or in Kandhamals in 2008. The Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, the RSS front set up for this purpose, specifically defines Adivasis as forest dwellers or Vanvasis, refusing to accept the claim to indigeneity and prior residence represented by the term Adivasi. However, as previous speakers have pointed out, it is important to locate this obliteration in a longer history of state practice, as well as the global colonization of indigenous lands, relying on discourses of civilization and savagery. Using savage methods against indigenous people has historically been justified on the grounds of their supposed savagery, whether intrinsic savagery or because they have the temerity to resist the state. How often have I heard paramilitary personnel and non-tribal migrants in predominantly Adivasi areas act as if or claim that Adivasis have no feelings. When Delhi University dropped Mahashweta Devi's story, Draupadi, on the grounds that it would hurt student feelings, Did they consider how the feelings of Adivasis are hurt when they are raped or killed or their families are killed during counterinsurgency, and how Adivasi students may feel when their realities are not reflected in the university curriculum? Even the right to have emotions is a threat in a supremacist regime. In my talk today, I present 4 arenas in which the state's acts of omission and commission in terms of service provision and displacement respectively, as well as its intrinsic majoritarianism, have supported the supremacist project of the RSS. And these 4 arenas are the state's support for the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram and the Freedom of Religion Acts, the politics of the census, mining and counterinsurgency, and schooling. Right from the 1940s, despite Nehru's Panchsheel policy, which aimed at respecting Adivasi culture, and despite the protective provisions of the constitution, the default position of the state has been soft Hindutva. The Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, or VKA, set up in the 1940s in Jashpur, which is now in Chhattisgarh, to counter Christian missionaries, had the support of the well-known Gandhian Thakkar Bapa, A.V. Thakkar, whose position on Adivasi rights, however, was far more respectful than that of the RSS. Similarly, the 1956 Christian Missionaries Inquiry Commission, or the Nyogi Commission set up by the Madhya Pradesh government to investigate the activities of Christian missionaries, was a forerunner of the current Freedom of Religion Acts in different states, which are actually about the religious unfreedom of Adivasis, in that they neither recognize their right to convert, nor the fact that quote-unquote Ghar Vapsi under RSS auspices is no homecoming, but instead is a conversion to dominant Hindu beliefs. The VKA explicitly modeled itself on the church, setting up schools and welfare activities like hostels and play centers in Adivasi areas. But unlike the Catholics, who won early converts primarily because they helped Adivasis on land issues, and who continue to have liberation theologists like Stan Swami, who has recently been institutionally murdered by the state, the primary function of the VKA's welfare work is to recruit full-timers for the RSS and foment hate against minorities. As Tariq Tachil has shown, the VKA acts as a multiplier for the electoral prospects of the BJP, especially in areas of poor service provision. It is also this impetus that drives the government to freeze the access to foreign funds of all NGOs working in Adivasi areas, as well as more generally, while allowing RSS funds to get foreign money as well as government support. While American evangelical Christianity, such as the Joshua Project, are seeking to make inroads in Adivasi areas, they are perhaps as much of a threat to the established church. The RSS and the VKA are always on the lookout for local disputes over religion to enable attacks on Christian communities, especially pastors and nuns. And this country will never be able to live down the gruesome murder of Graham Staines and his 2 small sons. I now come to the politics of the census, my second example, which is a classic example of the way in which default state majoritarianism has helped the Hindutva project. Colonial censuses allowed for the category of animism, but this was gradually whittled away. Currently, the census only allows for other religions. In practice, this means that Adivasis are by default listed as Hindus. For example, in Chhattisgarh, Hindus are listed as 94% of the population, while other religions constitute only 0.4% in the 2001 census of religion. However, the percentage of Adivasis in Chhattisgarh is more than 30%, and their faiths are quite distinct from the usual markers of Hinduism. Some of them worship Ravan rather than Ram, they identify with Mahishasur rather than Durga, but more importantly, their faith is centered around clan gods, village mother goddesses, and the earth, and has developed unique forms which deserve to be celebrated as world heritage rather than destroyed. In part, the census obliteration was because enumerators were drawn from the ranks of teachers who were mostly outsiders and Hindu, accompanied by schooling practices in which Adivasi names are changed to more Hinduized sounding names, and of course, the imposition of the dominant state language. However, since the 1940s, at least, the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha have been mobilizing over the census. In Jharkhand, they faced resistance, and in the 1951 census, where Bihar had a column for other religions tribal, Some 21% gave this as their religious identity. By 2001, the figure had fallen to 13% of people listing themselves as other religions. But in November 2020, the Jharkhand State Assembly passed a resolution asking the center to have a code for Sarna Dharm in the 2021 census. And across the country, there is a growing demand among Adivasi communities to have a separate code in the census to recognize Adivasi religions. My third example of the way in which Adivasi religion is being obliterated draws on the effects of mining and displacement. From Bapli Mandli and Niyamraj in Odisha to Surjagarh in Gadchiroli, from Raughat in North Bastar to Nandaraj in South Bastar, the gods of the hills are being destroyed by mining, accompanied by counterinsurgency. While the massive militarization of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and Odisha, Maharashtra, has been justified in the name of fighting Maoists, it is clear from the way that 22 paramilitary camps were set up around the sacred hill of Raughat that the primary intent was not to fight the Maoists, but to push through mining. Because Adivasi gods are not recognized, the government has no qualms about destroying their most sacred sites. And once the mountains, forests, and rivers have gone, the religion too is destroyed, the people are destroyed. Unlike Hinduism, Christianity, or Islam, the religion is not portable and is closely tied to place. This is not unique to India, prompting the mention in ILO 169 and UNDRFP of the need for governments to respect the religious, cultural, and spiritual rights of indigenous people. The 2000 Niyamgiri case, where the local Gram Sabhas or village councils were given the right to decide whether they wanted mining on their sacred hill, was perhaps unique, not just in giving people rights under the Panchayat Act or Forest Rights Act, but also in recognizing that Adivasis had religious freedom under Articles 25 and 26. The RSS has claimed that it was behind Salvajudum, the state-supported vigilantism that destroyed South Bastar from 2005 onwards, burning villages, killing people, raping women. But currently, it is paramilitary camps coming up on village commons, including sacred spaces, which are a major source of anger for villagers, both in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and elsewhere. My fourth example is drawn from schooling. And while the history of Adivasi interaction with other communities in India is quite different from that in the settler colonies, there are several disturbing parallels between the stolen generations of Canada or Australia. Let me just end here with a controversy similar to the one over this conference concerning another conference, the World Anthropology Congress, which was earlier slated to be held in 2023 at the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, a massive educational complex for Adivasi children in Odisha. Following reports that the children were being actively deculturalized, even more than in normal schools. They were not allowed to speak their own languages, they're punished, they're looked down upon. All this with the help of sponsors like the mining company Vedanta. The WAC withdrew. The small bunch of people raising this issue, including Virginius Khaka, my former colleague, a respected sociology who is also an Orao Adivasi himself, are now being attacked by Hindutva trolls and even anthropologists who see nothing wrong in soft Hindutva. But there is resistance, especially among the young. An Adivasi friend recently told me when we were discussing schooling that instead of the slogan Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, his group slogan was English Indigenous India. So to Indigenous India, I again say Jai Johar, Jai Bhim. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sundar. We have the last speaker of today's panel, Professor Yasmin Sakhiya. Professor Sakhiya is a professor of history and is the first holder of the distinguished Hard Nikachos Endowed Chair in Peace Studies in Arizona State University. She is the author of 3 monographs and several edited volumes and numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Her book, Fragmented Memories, won the Shrikanta Datta Best Book Prize in the Social Sciences and Northeast India from the Nehru Memorial, and Women, War and Making of Bangladesh won the Oral History Association's award. She's a recipient of multiple international fellowships and grants, including the prestigious National Endowment for Humanities, the Fulbright Fellowship, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and multi-year senior fellowships from the American Institute of Indian Bangladesh as well as Pakistani studies. She serves on several editorial boards and is the vice president of the South Asian Muslim Studies Association. Professor Sakhiya will discuss, Professor Sakhiya's topic is Muslims in Assam Challenging Humanity.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the organizers of this conference for giving us an opportunity to discuss serious academic issues that many of us have been working for many years. I want to thank my co-panelists for contributing wonderful papers. And I also want to thank the audience for listening to us and engaging with us about issues that concern almost everyone who's involved in the study of India or who lives in India or who has some relationship with India. So thank you, everybody. The question that I start with is, how did the Muslims of Assam become outsiders in Assam? This question has anchored my study of the history of the Muslims of Assam, which I've been pursuing for over 2 decades. Currently, the Muslim is a site of extreme othering, but there is a longer historical narrative of inclusivity, blending, and fusion, creating a we community recorded in the local pre-colonial chronicles of Assam called Burunjis. The blended or Hanmihuli we of Assam included Hindus, Muslims, and tribal communities. Today, I might be a lone voice articulating this history of Hanmihuli as it is receding into a distant background and the space is filled up by the politics of division that reduces Muslims into labels such as Mughals, illegal immigrant, Bangladeshi, and even termite. Backed by law and the new regulations of the National Register of Citizens, NRC, and the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, CAA, millions of Muslims are facing the threat of denationalization, disenfranchisement, and statelessness. As a historian of human ethics and peace, I'm deeply concerned that the anti-Muslim politics in Assam will have ramifying effects, undoing the humanity of both Hindus and Muslims, which in Maurice Blanchard's term is a writing of a disaster. Since we are allotted very limited time, I'll keep my presentation short. And although the Muslim problem in Assam is a vast and tangled topic, I will provide only very broad strokes of some exceptional moments highlighting the fragmentation of the we community in Assam. 35% of Assam's population is Muslim. Until the rise of Hindutva in Assam, the internal division among Muslims was expressed in spatial terms of Brahmaputra Valley and Barak Valley. Social interaction between these two communities of Muslims was irregular due to lack of communication between the two valleys, and the language divided the Assamese-speaking Muslims of the Brahmaputra Valley, generally referred to as Goria, from the Bengali-speaking Barak Valley Muslims. The Barak Valley Muslims are not the only Bengali-speaking Muslims in Assam. Nearly 18% of Assam's Muslim population are those who are derogatorily called Mia and targeted as outsiders since the Assam agitation of the 1980s. The Mias originally came from the region of Mymensingh in East Bengal in the early 20th century during the British colonial rule. They were encouraged to migrate for expanding agricultural productivity to feed the growing population, consequent to development of tea and oil industries in the region, and because of many food riots that occurred during that time. But they were confined by colonial rulers to settle in the riverine islands or chors and the sandbanks or chaporis of the Brahmaputra. Spatial alienation from the other groups in Assam, coupled with illiteracy, language barrier, poverty of agricultural livelihood in the precarious chors and chaporis, the Mymensingh transplants did not experience cultural or social hanmihuli with the upper class and middle class Assamese Hindus and Muslims. Nearly 100 years later, the BJP government is using a variety of legal tools as well as psychological and social pressure to divide Assam's Muslims, isolate the Mias further, and declare the majority of them as illegal Bangladeshi immigrants, throw them into detention camps, and transform them into stateless people. The majority of the Assamese, both Hindus and Goria Muslims, are not averse to this policy. Initially labeled as Mughals and invaders by colonials, which was reiterated by the BJP, the Gorias, after the BJP, the Gorias, soon after the BJP won the state election in 2021, were suddenly transformed into Khilonjia, or indigenous, attempting to seduce them with economic and social benefits if they cooperate in outing and eliminating the Mias from Assam. On the other hand, adopting the colonial rhetoric about the Bangla-speaking Muslims as land-hungry Maimansingias, the BJP government has cast them as Bangladeshi Mias. As early as 1931, the colonial administrator C.S. Mullen warned the Assamese that a demographic and cultural change would take place due to the influx of Bengali Muslims in Assam. The colonial discourse became a strident political rhetoric immediately after the first assembly election of 1937, when Syed Muhammad Sadullah, a Goria Muslim, became the premier of Assam. He was accused of growing more Muslims by allowing immigrants to settle and vote in the elections. The Hindu Mahasabha stoked native stranger tensions, and organizations such as the Assam Protection Society, the Jatiyo Mahasabha, the People's Assembly, and the Assam Pradesh Congress Party, led by Gopinath Bordoloi, too joined in the chorus of a Muslim invasion. Statistics, together with terms like native and outsider, which the British had used for administrative purposes, acquired new connotations in order to manufacture facts for political ends. It was the Congress central government that passed the Immigration Expulsion from Assam Act in 1950, followed in 1951 by the first National Register of Citizens, the NRC, which was conducted exclusively in Assam to identify and deport foreigners. Then in 1964, Foreigners Tribunal were established. A quasi-judicial body, it ceased to function after 1973, but was revived in 1979 when the student-led Assam agitation demanded the expulsion of foreigners. In the 1960s, a new body called Border Police was established to detect and deport all illegal foreigners. And between 1961 and 1966, the Border Police issued deportation notices to 215,794 foreigners. Following the 1967 Assembly election, when Gorias and Mias were accused of colluding and electing Muslim candidates, including Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, the Congress government created the Prevention of Infiltration Program, known as PIP. But soon after, in 1971, during the Bangladesh Liberation War, encouraged by the Indian government, large numbers of Bengalis from East Pakistan migrated to Assam, which caused great concern in the election year of 1978, when large groups of foreign nationals were identified as voting in the elections. Backed by several high-ranking police officers, the Assam government started its campaign to detect and deport illegal Bangladeshis. The RSS Sakhas working in Assam gave it a religious tinge and identified the Bengali Mia Muslims as an illegal Bengali community in Assam. The rallying cry of the Assam agitation that lasted from 1979 to 1985 was to drive out the Bangladeshis. In 1983, when more than 2,000 suspected Bangladeshis were killed overnight in a village called Meli, the Congress central government offered a resolution by passing the Illegal Immigration Detection by Tribunal Act, IMDT, putting the onus on the local government to detect and deport the illegal immigrants. The IMDT was scrapped in 2005 by the Supreme Court, and all cases were referred to the revived Foreigners Tribunal. After the Assam Accord was signed in 1985, the variety of governments that came to power took up the task of finding and deporting illegal Bangladeshis. In November 1998, the BJP-appointed governor, retired Lieutenant General S.K. Sinha, stated unequivocally that there has been demographic invasion of Muslims from Bangladesh. Consequently, hundreds and thousands of Muslims were declared to be doubtful or D-voters. D-voters were stripped of all rights and access to all public services and benefits. Another drastic change was the amendment of the Citizen Act of 1955 in 2003 during the Vajpayee's tenure as Prime Minister. Bloodline and descent became the determining factor for Indian citizenship, which was a racial way of interpreting who is an Indian. In August 2019, the NRC was implemented again. More than 1.9 million people were declared to be foreigners in Assam. Ironically, a vast majority of those left out of the NRC were Hindu Bengalis. Thus, in December 2019, the BJP government passed the new Citizenship Amendment Act, assuring citizenship to Hindus and Sikhs from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. This leaves only the Muslims who did not appear on the NRC as an alien group. Expelling the so-called illegal immigrants is not going to be easy because there has been no agreement with the government of Bangladesh. Instead, the BJP government has decided to lock up the unwanted people in 6 detention centers where thousands are being held without the cases being settled. Many have died waiting. New detention camps are currently under construction. The transformation of Muslims from settlers to migrants to immigrants to infiltrators to illegal Bangladeshis is a product of Hindutva, although the Congress Party too enabled this process in the failure to develop a well-measured and humane minority policy. Hindutva has made the face and the place of India tenuous for Muslims. Indian citizenship for them is fragile. The Gorias are anxious about the future and are blindly moving towards their own destruction. The Miyas are on the edge of a precipice, on the brink of losing home and citizenship. Many have committed suicide in desperation. As a historian of Assam and an Assamese, I understand the conditions in Assam today are abnormal, and we need a different kind of imagination to make each individual aware and responsible of the choices they make. We have the recourse of Hanmiholi, that is not simply a sentiment and an idealistic normative approach. It was a political tool of the Ahom kings who effectively created the undivided we people in Assam. The iconic Bhupen Hazarika reiterates the we in all his historical compositions, and it has been evocatively articulated by writers like Syed Abdul Malik, Imran Shah, Medini Chaudhry, Bhupen Sakhiya, and many others in Assam. Hanmiholi has allowed the Tea tribe communities to be recognized as an Adivasi group of Assam, despite being 20th century transplants. The Sikhs have become Assamese Punjabis, Assamese Marwaris. I have witnessed Hanmiholi at work during the COVID lockdown last year in Assam, when Mia boatmen and Assamese middlemen vendors agreed to support one another. These men recognize one another, however briefly, as fellow humans. These fugitives softening ideological obsession. Adaptability and inclusivity is a human virtue, requiring its own brand of Assamese depends on look at oppression and the ideology of Hindutva, whose political and social structure is to divide, and capacity to be humane is in the can claim if they choose autonomy over servility. Thank you.
We have a lot of audience questions coming in, so I'm going to start. The first question is a general question to all of the panelists. It kind of relates to some of the points raised by Professor Junaid early on about the impossibility of going back and reclaiming a mind of secularism and secular politics in India. So this question is for...
I'll just try to answer. I think the question of, because for different communities, or in pre-Modi, pre-Hindutva state place, and we had a 30-year-long counterinsurgency war in Kashmir, brutalization of people, and the political, dispossession that had continued from that how instrumentally used to, and once we have a recognition of that pluralistic future, where we give which was a prison for so many peoples, and so once we sort of realize can have a voice of their own determination in a broader philosophical sense, aspire to live a dignified life.
So I perhaps a happy pluralism, but coexistence, consumption of beef trees that we possibly can think about it in the particularly the North-Indian history of the future.
Next question.
No, I think.
And also to Professor Sakhiya and Junaid is that there's another way to say more about the land reforms in Jammu and Kashmir being the challenge to Hindu supremacy. So Junaid, a little bit about the land reform, follow up with the difference between Kashmir and the Northeast.
In Kashmir, these were a very progressive sort of step for Kashmir, become a long century of dispossession under the Hindutva state that had existed. And the land reform